Revolution podcast. Even though I'm not on air, I'm still your host for these, Jason Miles. I'm trying to enjoy my break, and I haven't broke yet. I'm really bad at taking vacations, as you can see. Well, here we are. This episode was a really good conversation we had with a young man named Matthew Petti, who was with the Quincy Institute, which is a think tank. And he wrote some really interesting articles about U.S. involvement and the history of U.S. involvement in the Middle East. And we added to so it was a nice mashup for the Saturday show. It was not just me, Pascal, and our regular Saturday morning cohorts. It was me, Pascal, Marcus, and then the foreign policy crew of Jean Bajlan and Kuba Rizneski, who are going to be doing a show once a month on Wednesday. Also with another part of the one of the original members of the foreign policy crew, Maria Repnikova. And I thought this was a very rich conversation with a lot of different perspectives when it comes to U.S. policy in the Middle East. It's, as one person commented, it's not just extremely isolationist, kind of anti-interventionist. It isn't real basic U.S. bad. It's more in-depth, especially that's why we wanted Matthew on the show, because he actually talks about the other foreign actors in the Middle East. And this was the Saturday free show, so this is a longer episode. So generally on Wednesday, when you hear this, most of you will be hearing this for the first time Wednesday morning. We dump the Saturday episode. We call it Saturday the free show, because we just go, we don't stop after an hour. So if you want to be a part of this conversation on Saturday, there's one way, or the best way, is YouTube. YouTube.com/This is Revolution Podcast. You can live type comment, and as you will hear in the show, that we actually are responding to comments that are not just super chats. And for the other shows where we do go to the Patreon bonus half, if you want to hear all of those, extra discussions, deeper dives, sometimes there's more silliness behind a paywall. Well, there's one way to do it. Patreon.com/Bitter Lake Presents. And you get all the access to all the bonus half, and you get the access to the movie night, which we haven't done in a while. I've been working on an idea for movie night, bringing in Dr. Michael Harris, who wrote Welcome to the Rebellion, which is using the Star Wars movies as a grand narrative for the left. And he also wrote, oh God, I can't remember the second book, but it is about the Hunger Games movies, kind of using that as an analogy for current collapse of capitalism. So he's written another book, and he's gone down a bit of a science fiction rabbit hole. So I've been thinking about maybe one of these movies that he suggested. We can watch that, and then we'll have a talk with him afterwards. And we watch these on Discord, and we got everybody's faces showing. So for me, it's a little closer to back in the day to a live music performance, and people chime in and we talk and hang out, and it's a lot of fun. So movie night you get access to. You get access to the Mau Mau Hour with Pascal Robert, where he will pick a topic and kind of go off on it and just talk to you guys in live time, and that's also a lot of fun. So there's some great things happening with the show coming up when I return on air from this break. Pascal and I are still going to be making appearances on some other shows. I don't have dates yet to pitch. But when you hear this, I will have done an episode of Give Them an Argument with Ben Burgess, and it was me and Nando Villa. And I won't have a date, but go to Give Them an Argument on YouTube. So youtube.com/Give Them an Argument. It's Ben Burgess's YouTube channel. And get ready for a very good, in-depth conversation about U.S. foreign policy, and also, because we have the Professor Jean Bajlan, always history. We give you the history for context of a lot of these countries. So that sound is my cue. Thank you guys so much for listening. Please share, please like, please subscribe wherever you're listening to this. And I am out. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. Let me turn down the chill music that we used to open the show. I hope you guys like that wonderful picture of former President Jimmy Carter. But before we get to today's topic and I introduce my co-host, I would like everyone to like and subscribe, hit the bell, and leave a comment. As you already know, we do read the comments. Also, if you have the means, support us on Patreon or check out our merch. With Patreon, you get access to the after hours and our Discord server. And remember, when we get to 1,000 patrons, we will be doing a live show somewhere. Not saying where just yet. And COVID pending in California. With all that said, let me bring in my co-host, my homie, my dog, Mr. Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Ooh.
I gave you a double.
Peace and greetings, Jason Miles.
Just because I love the canary yellow that you're wearing right now.
It is canary yellow. I just like to make two announcements for the audience and well the chat and our guests. Number one, today is the 50th anniversary of the murder of George Jackson, Soledad brother, black radical activist, Blood in My Eye, as well as the author of Soledad Brothers. We are still in Black August, so we just want to remember and commemorate the death of that comrade. Second of all, September 11th of this year will be the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and the war on terror. And what we're trying to do today with our show is that we're going to be asking our guest, Matthew Petti, specific questions about his writings, but we're also going to try to use this show as a retrospective on what has the 20-year war on terror really meant for American empire, American foreign policy, as well as the Middle East and the Muslim world. So we're going to try to interrogate, as we say on This is Revolution, some of those factors on our show today.
And without any further ado, let's introduce the rest of our Saturday crew today, which is a little bit of a mix between our Saturday crew and our foreign policy crew. No longer the token in Maine. He is one of many in Virginia. Marcus from the Left Flank Vets.
No, eventually, Blacchiavelli, he returns back to the halls of power to advise and critique the moves of the hierarchy. So here I am. I got a meeting with Biden Monday afternoon.
Is that you just yelling at him at a Starbucks?
Yeah, he's asleep the whole time, and then someone comes in, gives him his ice cream cone, and then I leave. That's basically how it goes.
The more I have to do these videos, the more I find these old clips of Biden as a senator, because I think he used to head quite a few committees, and he was a horrible public speaker. He has never been a good public speaker.
Never. It is amazing. You know what I'm saying? When people talk about
To be fair, this is a man who had a lifelong speech impediment. Well, not lifelong, a childhood.
Yeah, no, and that's the thing is I'm not talking about stutter aside. There's nothing to do with the stutter. The words that he chooses, the inflection, get up. He was threatening journalists in the 80s.
There's nothing about him that surprises me. So when people talk about cognitive decline, I'm like, yeah, maybe. But have you ever watched him speak in the 80s?
This is Joe Biden. Come on, Jack. What are you talking about?
Lied about ending apartheid. That was the best one. But we will get into that possibly later or not. Coming live from the epicenter of the second COVID outbreak, locked in a bunker deep in the heartland of America, he is everyone's favorite Professor Dad, Mean Gene Bajlan.
Good morning, gentlemen. Excellent to see you this fine summer day. If Biden sees you, Marcus, he's probably going to mix you up with Corn Pop. He's like, hey, it's Corn Pop. He's a bad dude.
He's got this rusty chain underneath my desk.
Corn Pop's a bad dude.
He's bad.
He's a bad dude. Don't shout at him. I actually would like to see Pascal shout at Joe Biden, but, what's the point?
And from a bunker somewhere in the great Northwest, we can't say where because we're not allowed to know. We talk to this man. Our phone sounds funny afterwards. He is our deep state representative, Deep State Cuba.
Gentlemen,
Cuba with the sigil of the Department of Defense on his screen.
It's the
what is that, Cuba?
It's real.
Don't tell him. Don't tell him.
If you need to ask, then you shouldn't know.
You don't have the clearance. If you need to ask, you don't have the security clearance.
If you knew what it was,
you
would laugh even harder. But I'll tell you in the side message what it is, and you'll probably start laughing. And let's bring in our guest, shall we? Gene, do you want to introduce our guest?
You can go ahead. Go ahead with it.
Are you sure?
Yeah, you have the bio.
I do. Matthew Petti, our guest, is a research assistant at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and reporter. He's a former national security reporter at the National Interest, and his work has appeared in several publications, including the Armenian Weekly, Reason, and the American Magazine. Please welcome, also coming from a secret location somewhere in the East, Matthew Petti.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Welcome.
Welcome, Matthew.
Pascal, or Gene, you want to start off with the first question?
Yeah, so
sorry. Before you do, just want to correct. I'm not at the Quincy Institute right now. Because I'm in a week. I'm going to Jordan to study Arabic. So that's was, not is.
So you were in the Quincy Institute. Just for our viewers, the Quincy Institute is one of the few think tanks in DC at the moment that does actual proper anti-interventionist American foreign policy, so that people are aware. People like Daniel Bessner are associated with it, Tarita Parsi, I forget the other fellows, but they have good people there. And it's an important institute. You know, there's criticism due to some of its funding sources, but frankly, in the inverted commas foreign policy blob swamp, they do important and good work in sort of having the kind of contrarian idea that perhaps America intervening in everywhere in the world, instead of making things better, actually might make things worse both for the United States and for the people in the region who suffer from American imperialism. So they do a lot of important work, and I do recommend that people check out some of the things that the Quincy Institute has been putting out over the years. So I thought I would ask, although it's not the main topic of our conversation today, and this is not really Matthew's area of specialization, I thought I would just ask Matthew, just for some of his thoughts about what's going on in Afghanistan before we move on to sort of the other topics we wanted to talk about with you today. Do you have any thoughts about what it means, how it's being covered, and what it tells us about American empire at this moment in time?
Sure. Yeah, so I want to caveat this, I'm not an Afghan or an Afghanistan expert, so I can speak in very general terms. What seems to have happened over the past 10 years was that the Taliban built a social base in Afghanistan and broadened its base, while the U.S.-backed government did not, and was outside of urban centers, was basically, based on held together with guns and airstrikes. And so come 2018 or 2019, the Taliban were strong enough to basically present the U.S. with a choice of talk or escalate the war. And the Trump administration chose talks, which the Biden administration continued. Part of that meant pulling U.S. troops out of the country. Why the talks failed, why the Afghan government broke down so quickly, I think that is a question that we're not really going to have full answers to. And, everybody has their hot takes now, and there is some good on the ground reporting about specific events that happened. But I think this is something that historians will kind of have to debate. But yeah, after we left, the whole thing came down like a house of cards. The Taliban more or less assumed power immediately. And it's kind of, there's a lot of, talk in the blob, the DC foreign policy establishment, about how the U.S. presence in Afghanistan was sustainable and low cost. No, it wasn't. It was sustainable and low cost in terms of it doesn't show up in Americans' TV screens, but this was the past 2 years were a very brutal civil war for Afghans. Hundreds of people were dying in a single month. The Taliban were making serious gains despite very heavy U.S. airstrikes. And what Biden decided to do is basically extract the U.S. from a civil war where it didn't really have that many material interests in winning. And I think, it's a very bad human tragedy. But I do think Biden made the right call of not getting lots more people killed to prolong the inevitable. And but a lot of Americans have trouble accepting this. The Afghan war was kind of the it's tied to 9/11 in people's minds. It was kind of a righteous revenge operation from the beginning, and so it's very hard for people, especially in the foreign policy elite, to let go of this. And of course, there's the human tragedy has moved from all the stuff happening away from the cameras and in the countryside to, and don't get me wrong, human tragedy, but now it's right in front of the cameras. But yeah, we'll have to see what happens. I'm sorry if I sound vague, but I'm not an expert. So.
I know. I honestly, I think one of the very important things you said is like, there's like that. This thing is not. It's not going to be like easy to like. Everyone's got these hot takes, but it's like there's no like one reason. Like any like large scale intervention or even like military. In some cases military takeover. Some cases you're just talking about just convincing people who haven't gotten paid and or like food, bullets, ammunition, gear, to just diplomatic exchanges at the very end. Like there's like a myriad of all these things where literally relationships that are decades and decades old are now coming to fruition. But I do want to hit up this super chat though. I think by accident Biden has landed the industrial military complex, biggest blow ever. Its humiliation is total, utterly impotent. And I would actually push back against that, because if you look what's going on, the Pentagon budget is going up, and the Pentagon doesn't take an L without looking for another fight. This is something that's already been pushing, and like a lot of people already talk about like the Cold War with China, but there's definitely some, I think other areas in the world that we're probably going to get into as to why the military industrial complex is, I guess, still strong as ever.
Yeah, something that kind of scares me about this. I mean, after the end of Vietnam, after the end of the Vietnam War, the Reagan administration kind of tried to get over Vietnam syndrome by escalating like crazy in Central America. That's how we got, I mean, it's not the only reason, but that's one of the big reasons why the Contras War happened and these very bloody counterinsurgencies happened in Central America. And I kind of worry that the U.S. is going to take out its frustrations on some other country and just, but at the same time, I think things are different. Like the U.S., a lot of the U.S. elite, I think, recognizes now that we are a power in relative decline and we can't afford to just go smashy on everything every time we're frustrated. I mean, the 80s, the context of the 80s was, first of all, we had like what the US, elite saw as an existential threat in the Soviet Union. And there was kind of a fight to really throw ourselves into. But, well, it's weird that I'm saying we, but, nowadays, I think there's no real, despite these kind of grand unified enemy theories where like China and Iran and Russia and all these are creating this axis of authoritarianism. Like it's an attempt to recreate the conditions of the Cold War, but that's not the conditions that we're in. And I think also there's a lot more war weariness in the public. It's just not going to work in the same way.
I think actually one of the major contributing factors to the truth that you're demonstrating here is that for the first time in a while, we have a right-wing faction of American politics that is not romanticizing interventionism, but is actually taking a desire to get people out of these conflagrations that we've been in for the last 20 years. I mean, the fact that Trump was campaigning on, these wars are stupid, let's get out of here, when usually it's the right flank of capital or the reactionary right that is traditionally kind of like, let's go, like, Americans flag waving patriotism. I think that's what's actually causing the shift in the mentality in the American body politic to say these wars are stupid, we shouldn't have ever gotten there. And if it was the opposite, I think that, people will be like even more antagonistic to Biden's posture. Even Trump said he supported Biden pulling out. He just criticized the way he did it. So what's interesting is that will the liberal flank of the ruling class end up becoming the barometer of interventionism thus forth going onward, when the reactionary right has now moved into this kind of American isolationist posture. I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on that.
I guess I question though of like how anti-interventionist Trump actually was, or just buying into a message that he kind of got correctly, like blind squirrel, broken clock type of issue. Because while he was talked about being against Iraq for a while, ended up making some deals with the Taliban to withdraw troops out of Afghanistan. He still did pull out of the JCPOA, and he also then did the the Soleimani strike. But I don't know if this is a good transition. But speaking of the JCPOA, Matthew, could you please just kind of talk to us about what the Iran nuclear deal was, and kind of I guess I think is a substantial change in what was some foreign policy dealings with Iran coming from the United States.
Sure. And also just to add to the Trump thing, I just finished reading Reign of Terror by Spencer Ackerman. Great book. He makes the case that Trump was not against war. He just hated the idea of like losing or like dumb wars, which meant you just up the brutality, which is what he did. And I think, yeah, you're right. Iran is a good case study of this. So I guess first things first, nuclear weapons are not that complicated to make. It's 1940s technology. The U.S. built it with like slide rules. The main barriers to building one are that it's time consuming and expensive, and therefore very easy to detect. You have to enrich a lot of uranium. You put it in these like centrifuges. I don't know the science exactly, but you put in these centrifuges and spin it until you refine the type of uranium you need. And so Iran has been doing this for a while. It doesn't actually have a weapons program, or it hasn't since 2003, but all the same, it's been collecting this nuclear material, which it says is for peaceful purposes, but anyone with half a brain can see that once you accumulate enough of it, you can use it for bombs. And so this kind of presented the U.S. government with a dilemma that's often put this way, like an Iranian bomb or bomb Iran, where you can let the Iranians build. And, Iran is a country with both the means and motivation to want to build nuclear weapons. It is a medium-sized, medium-large industrialized country, and it's surrounded by enemies and it's on the superpower shit list. So, basically take that and the fact that they are enriching uranium and they do have a fairly sophisticated nuclear program. And, U.S. presidents are faced with the dilemma of Iranian bomb or bomb Iran. You can accept that over time, Iran is going to get closer and more likely to actually getting a nuclear weapon, or you can use force to stop it. And given how, antsy the Israelis and the Saudis are, and particularly the Israelis, how willing they are to proactively use military force, that might not even be a choice. If Iran gets close to having a weapon, the Israelis might just unilaterally start a war, which would, given the U.S.-Israeli relationship and the kind of domestic politics of Israel, it'd be very hard not to join in with. Very hard not for a U.S. president not to come to Israel's defense. So the Obama administration decided to take a third way. You can dissuade the Iranians through means other than war from building a bomb. So they basically imposed a lot of economic sanctions, basically unplugging the Iranian economy from the world banking system. When that caused enough kind of internal problems and chaos, they then come to the table and they tell the Iranians, we'll lift the sanctions. We'll get the sanctions on a multilateral basis. So it's the Americans, the Europeans, the Chinese, and the Russians will basically allow Iran to participate in the world economy, but they've got to submit to very strict restrictions on their nuclear program. Like, they've got cameras in all these facilities. They've got very short notice inspections. They've got limits on how much uranium they can enrich. And so that kind of kills two birds with one stone. I mean, in a way, it's like a win-win for America, right? Accepting Western investment and opening yourself up to Western markets is something that the U.S. imposes on other countries by force, but Iran is taking that as payment for restricting its ability to build a bomb. So that's more or less what the JCPOA was. It was a way to avert a crisis where Iran is on the threshold of building nuclear weapons.
So maybe I want to pick up on something else that you mentioned in a lot of your writing. The intervention problem in the Middle East is not just about the United States and its unilateral moves, although that's certainly been the most spectacular instance. But could you talk a little about the configuration of the different regional powers, what they're trying to do, and why it is that you see Emirati troops or Turkish proxies in places like Yemen and Libya?
Sure. Did we want to discuss more on the JCPOA? Because I feel like I'm leaving people with the impression that it's still active.
No, let's stick with the JCP for now, and get to that question in a moment. Like, can you? I think Kuba's question is really important because that was something we did want to tackle. But can we talk a little bit about like what actually happened with the JCP? Because as you noted, the JCP lasted even through the first couple of years of the Obama administration.
Can we actually define the JCPOA for the audience in terms of specific terms, please?
The nuclear deal. It's just the term for the nuclear deal I was describing earlier, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. But usually they just call it the nuclear deal, or they use JCPOA if they want to be. But yeah, that's basically internationally lifting the sanctions in exchange for Iran regulating its nuclear program, or submitting to international regulations on its nuclear program.
So what happened with the nuclear deal, and why was it so easy for Trump to reverse that deal in the first place? And what is the impact of that being, both on sort of regional politics and on Iranian politics, and also more broadly on perceptions of the U.S. around the world?
Sure. So the thing with lifting the sanctions is a lot of the sanctions are written into law in Congress, and very heavy lobbying by hawkish groups and by pro-Israel groups basically made sure that there is both public and congressional opposition to the deal. So if Obama was going to live up to the American end of it, that basically meant using his presidential powers to like suspend the sanctions, but the sanctions were never actually taken out of the law books. And so more or less what happened under Trump was, with a stroke of a pen, he got out of the nuclear deal. And then a few months later, he began a campaign called Maximum Pressure. The idea was not only are we going to go back to the old Obama sanctions, but we're actually going to wage an all-out economic war on Iran with the goal. I mean, they were very coy about it, and it was very strange. Like they would they would come right up to the line of saying it without saying it. But the goal was to lead to the collapse of the Iranian government. The idea among conservatives or hawkish conservatives in the U.S. was basically that the Iranian system is so weak that if you just push it over a little bit, you just cause another economic crisis, and you escalate military tensions with them, that the government will just collapse, and then we won't have to worry about this nuclear program. And it's kind of dark because it wasn't like even like the Iraq War in 2003, where they had a government in exile they wanted to impose on Iran. It was basically they just wanted to collapse the state and see what happens, Libya style. And so, basically Trump imposes the maximum pressure sanctions. The Iranians try to hit back with all sorts of covert military operations, blowing up oil tankers, sending militias to fight, to harass U.S. troops in Iraq, etc. That ends up building up to first the July 2019 crisis, when the U.S. flies a surveillance drone right near Iranian territory. Iran shoots it down, and then Trump comes within a few minutes of ordering an airstrike on Iran. And then the bigger crisis, January 2020, when there's clashes between American and Iranian forces in Iraq, which leads to Trump assassinating the Iranian external security chief, Qasem Soleimani, and then Iran hitting the U.S. with missiles, which kind of after, it was very weird because, and in the meantime, there was massive internal unrest in Iran. there was an uprising, popular uprising in November 2019, which the regime put down with massacres, more or less. They shut down the internet and they killed hundreds of people. And then January 2020 came, the US assassinates Soleimani, the Iranians fire missiles at an American base. And then it seems like the American ruling class just kind of like threw up their hands and gave up. Like they kept the sanctions, but they weren't really escalating anymore. They kind of realized they were stuck. Like, you know, the Iranian system, yes, had been weakened, not only within Iran, but around the region, but like they kind of hit a floor of how far they could push things. And once the Iranians showed their willingness to hit back and to risk war, I think that kind of spooked them a little bit. And now we're in this kind of stalemate where Biden continues to enforce these sanctions on Iran, even though he doesn't want to. There's no real attempt to do regime change, but there's no real attempt to get out of this, to dismantle this machinery, which is designed for regime change. And, you know, the Biden team has been telling the Iranians that they want to go back to the nuclear deal. And I think they're genuine about it. But because of opposition from Republicans and moderate Democrats like Senate Foreign Relations Chair Bob Menendez, they've been very slow about it and kind of playing hard to get and hinting that they want to like renegotiate the deal. And so now the Iranians are playing hard to get. It's kind of this great stuckness. It's this great crisis that nobody can really break out of. That, you know, the American public and ruling class don't want a war with Iran, but they also don't really want to spend the political capital necessary to get off the path to war.
Wow.
I wanted to ask you a question, Matthew, about the motivation behind the Iran nuclear deal. In terms of chatter that I had seen in the Muslim world in certain English language Muslim publications, as well as talking to some writers on the left, some speculated that the U.S. pivot to Iran under the Obama administration was a consequence of frustration with the Saudi petrol monarchies and the way they were being involved in the Middle East through their covert support for, you know, basically terrorist organizations like ISIS as well as others. So there was a belief on the part of some analysts in that area that the pivot to the Iran nuclear deal was basically as a consequence of the frustration of the U.S. in its ability to trust its normal ally, Saudi Arabia, as a good steward of the politics in that region and pivoting to Iran. Do you agree with that analysis? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, so I think the most immediate reason for the nuclear deal was avoiding a war, was the idea that if we don't, if we get to this crisis point of the Iranians being on the threshold of a nuclear weapon, either the U.S. will have to strike or the Israelis will strike and force the U.S. into a war. I think that was the immediate reason. But I do think there was a hope in the Obama administration that you could have a more balanced policy that wouldn't rely so much on the Saudis. I mean, Obama had explicitly said this. He complained that there were free riders in the region, that the Saudis need to learn to share the region. These comments really spooked them. And I think that does kind of speak to a hope he had that, I mean, I don't think the U.S. and Iran would ever have the same kind of client relationship that the U.S., well, never say never, but I don't think there was a real prospect of the U.S. having the same kind of client relationship with Iran that they had with the Saudis, but there was an idea of like, we don't necessarily want to lean on these guys so much. They're not necessarily the most well put together, reliable client state.
So maybe I think that this might be a good moment to reintroduce my question, because we see a lot of instability in the Middle East and constant interventions by different parties. The region under the Cold War and even through the 1990s was often described as being in this terrible glacial stasis where you had sclerotic 30-year military dictatorships in countries like Egypt and countries like Syria, a sort of constant stable state of repression without prospects for change or any kind of internal dynamism. And now we've gone to a situation where there's a number of failed states, anything could happen. And the players involved aren't just the superpowers, but also all of these regional powers. To what extent is there a search for a new regional order as part of U.S. policy? To what extent has the U.S. undermined existing sources of stability within the region? Is there any way to put it together so that the Middle East looks more like Southeast Asia or even Latin America without the constant destabilization of failed states, foreign interventions, refugees?
So, well, if we're talking about the search for a new regional order, I mean, I think the U.S. ruling class doesn't quite know what it wants out of the Middle East. It feels that it can't show weakness. You know, there's a very strong idea of credibility and resolve. So it doesn't want to let its enemies gain at all. But it also, I mean, more or less what's happened, I think, post-Arab Spring development that a lot of people have been sleeping on is that the U.S. allies themselves have started to fracture. So, you know, there was always a talk of like an Iranian-Saudi Cold War. These are the two poles of the order. And I think this is true from like the 80s and 90s and maybe the early 2000s. But after the Arab Spring, what happened is that you had varying U.S. allies reacting in various ways to it. Well, I shouldn't say allies because the only U.S. treaty ally in the Middle East is Turkey. But you basically had the Saudis and the Emiratis kind of cautiously supporting revolutionaries in Iranian client states like Syria. But then basically once the Muslim Brotherhood won the elections in Egypt, which is like a populist Islamist movement that kind of threatens the you know, anti-populist conservative monarchies, these states became very reactionary towards any kind of popular movement. And you had them backing the military coup in Egypt, military strongman in Libya, etc. And then on the other hand, you have Qatar and Turkey, who are also U.S. partners, who actually saw the Arab Spring and these Islamic populist movements like the Muslim Brotherhood as an opportunity to favorably reshape the region. And so you had them supporting the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. You had them supporting the Syrian uprising to a much greater degree that the Saudis and Emiratis did, and so on. And so you have this kind of Saudi plus Emirati versus Qatari-Turkish Cold War going on. Both sides are U.S. partners. Both of them are armed with a shit ton of U.S. weapons and protected by U.S. troops, but they're also going at each other. I mean, directly going at each other.
But not even limited to Cold War. The Saudis suspended Qatar from the GCC. They blockaded it for a long period of time, gave them a list of demands. It came very close to open fighting. Not to mention the the Saudi intervention in Bahrain following the Arab Spring. It feels like there's several different sets of cleavages. One is the Sunni Shia, Iran versus Saudi. Another is the, let's call it, Arab Spring populist versus the autocratic old guard. There's one interesting development out of all this is that the regional isolation of Israel has ended, where Israel is now a dance partner much more openly with countries in the GCC and other Muslim powers.
Did you guys notice that the deep state is monitoring Cuba? Make sure he doesn't say anything wrong in the background.
Yeah, that's my PRC boss.
I do want to ask a question to the panel to bring up what Matthew said that I think is actually very important, kind of a bit of the crux of what Pascal wanted to talk about today. If the U.S. doesn't know what it wants to do in the Middle East, and with the Afghanistan papers coming out, kind of reiterating, not just the U.S. doesn't know, but the U.S. doesn't have an understanding of, it seems like any of the politics of the Middle East. What does that say? And I ask this question to everybody on the panel. What does that say about the relations between us and the Middle East moving forward?
I think one thing it says is that the United States is not as good of a manager of empire as the British or the French, for sure. Because these are countries that were able to maintain a level of kind of not total hegemony, but influence in that part of the world for large parts of the 19th and 20th century. And I think that America is a very clumsy steward of empire.
I would add to that. I'd say I totally agree. There is a kind of, it comes down to an issue of where Americans believe their ideology too much, right? In the 19th century, the British and the French were self-consciously doing imperialism. And if you look at critiques of American empire from the political right, the people like Niall Ferguson, who is an arch advocate for American imperialism, or someone like Sam Faddis, who was a former CIA operative, their critiques in some ways mirror critiques on the left. The issue they have is their solutions are different, which is do imperialism better, right? We're not doing imperialism well enough. We need to accept that we're doing imperialism, and we need to start, give up on all this like liberal nonsense which undermines ourselves, because American imperialism is dangerous. Obviously, there is a sort of crass economic rationale at times for American imperialism, especially in Latin America. There's also a crass economic motivation in terms of imperialism being and military operations being used, as Kuber often says, as a methodology to kick open the U.S. Treasury and drain resources from the American public, where Middle Eastern people become collateral damage in a desire to loot
like
this.
Migrant refugees. They bear the human cost of what's essentially a wealth transfer from American public coffers to private contractors.
Wow.
But the Americans, I would add, like their nation building efforts are undermined by that kind of these contradictory forces within empire building, which is like, oh, we have to bring about a parliament. We have to make them have 25% women, and then you have all these different sort of contradictory forces making it. The most successful American interventions, whether you agree with them or not, and not even American interventions. Look at Russia. Russia intervenes into Syria. They boot ISIS out of certain areas because they're dealing with a power. They're not telling the Syrian government, oh, can you do human rights and stuff like that? They just go in, support their guys, and then shoot out, right? Whereas the Americans are like, oh yeah, we're gonna do all this brutality, but also we're gonna cry about this brutality, and it's gonna be a mess.
Look, I think the U.S. empire is. The U.S. empire is sorry.
I think that the 1980s, late 80s, 90s experience of just American triumph in the Cold War, especially the transformation of Eastern Europe from the front line of the Eastern Bloc into genuine, popular, pro-Western, pro-American democracies, future EU member states, future NATO partners, really created a false model, a false impression of what it takes to do empire right. And that experience, which was very unique and very historically contingent and had as much to do with Western Europe as it did with the United States, then becomes this intoxicating model. It's the rush that the American foreign policy establishment chases after that, because it not only gives you the strategic benefits of flipping a major region, the economic benefits of opening up all of these economies, but it also, most importantly, reinforces your self-image and the narrative about yourself and your actions in the world that you want to project. And so it becomes flattering, it becomes intoxicating, and there's this idea that it becomes hegemonic in Washington, both on the left and on the right, that if you can just smash the bad guys, then the people of Iraq, the people of Afghanistan, the people of Syria, you name it.
What happens when you don't know who the bad guy is?
Oh, they're all the bad guys are the ones that say mean things about America. And then you get rid of those, and then you'll just have this organic, spontaneous, and the libertarians love this formulation because it reflects their impression of how the market economy is supposed to work. You're gonna have this organic, spontaneous reorganization towards a pro-Western ally where everything works out fine. And that, no matter how many times that story gets falsified by the actual aftermath of American interventions, that moment of glory is what I think a lot of foreign policy leaders and foreign policy thinkers have in their mind as what imperial management should look like.
Yeah, although I do want to push back, I think American empire is very competent when it knows it's very competent when there are real interests, like serious interests at stake. Like America they have competent people. They know what they're doing. They know what they want in East Asia. They have competent bureaucracies in Europe. Latin America, they've been paid very ruthless attention to what U.S. interests are and how to maximize U.S. power. I think a lot of these imperial pathologies are unique to the Middle East and Central Asia, or at least way more flagrant there, because it's an area where the U.S. does not have very strong economic interests and that are geographically very far away from the U.S. I mean, apart from the kind of petro enclaves where you have these big American oil companies, a lot of American investment, and giant American military bases, like chaos in Syria doesn't really affect U.S. interests. Like there's not American companies invested there whose property can get taken. It's not like Syria can pose a military threat to the U.S. And so that becomes a kind of playground for these really crazy ideologues. Similar thing happened in the 80s in Central America, where Latin America is very important for U.S. interests, but like the Central American countries specifically were, it was firmly within the U.S. sphere of influence. There's not really a risk of the Soviets coming in. And so these people who are like too crazy to put in Europe or something, like John Bolton, Elliot Abrams, Oliver North, you put them in Nicaragua and say, go make a revolution there. And, they won't start a nuclear war there. And those people graduated to the Middle East after 9/11, where, again, there was a lot of it's kind of a frontier. There was a lot of violence happening and not a lot of threats to the material basis of U.S. power. So I think
you're also describing Ukraine, the contemporary situation in Ukraine, which is another case of bad imperial management from the perspective of the United States, and also this kind of distance and low level of engagement.
I want to push back against the notion that this incompetence is only limited to the Middle East and far places. If that's the case, and I'm open for suggestion, how do we explain the Juan Guaido Venezuela affair and the complete ridiculous way that ended up playing out? I mean, it's a pure demonstration of kind of American fecklessness in terms of managing even a decent coup d'etat, which we used to be so good at back in the good old days.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, actually. Yeah, this is the kind of thing in the 80s in Latin America that the U.S. would have just been like that. But on the other hand, I mean, I think a lot of times when people see chaos, they think, okay, this is America failing. But perhaps the deepest of deep states doesn't mind this outcome. Like, it's not the ideal, but it's, there's no real strong Venezuelan state that can threaten, export revolution or threaten the U.S. ability to act in Colombia, right? It's a failed state, and I think there's a faction of the ruling class that's fine with that, as long as it's not a powerful challenger.
I'd like to ask Kuba if he agrees with this axiom: America would rather a failed state than a strong sovereign opposition.
So I think that and I'm glad that we've turned to this topic, because I think that we need to distinguish between different elements of the American foreign policy apparatus and different elements of the American deep state. So there are sectional interests within the within that community. And different groups have different levels of resources, freedom of operation, and influence at different points. For instance, under George W. Bush, you had this neocon wing that upended some of the groundwork that Clinton had laid down for a more kind of multilateral, liberal style system of intervention. And with Trump, you have a different set of people who set policy and influence. And I'm not just talking about over time, but you also within these bureaucracies, and Matthew said the deepest parts of the deep state. And I think you do have this, especially on the kind of covert and intelligence side, you have highly empowered agencies or even individuals that operate with very little supervision and in a very narrow or limited scope. So they don't necessarily make a ripple on the larger strategic canvas, but on a country by country basis, they can have outsized influence. And the people who are in favor of stability, the New World Order, George H.W. Bush types, they exist, but I think they've been on a 20-year defensive. First from George W. Bush style unilateralism, and later from all of these humanitarian or other, other justifications for destabilizing intervention in places like Libya, Yemen. The idea of respecting sovereignty has been shredded for a very long time. And I think that coexisting with the lack of a grand vision for ordering, for creating or maintaining a rules-based international order, which is just an empty slogan that they say now. You have...
No, it means we rule and this is based.
Yeah, exactly. Like, we make the rules, and yeah. So I think that Matthew made a great point about saying that the United States doesn't know what it wants. Like the central strategic leadership, the people who should be Henry Kissingering the planet, no judgment, right? I'm not saying that would be a good thing, but the people who should be playing that role for American empire aren't at a place where they're ready to face reality, to actually architect a new order.
Who is playing that role currently in you guys' opinion?
I think instead that you have a great deal of policy drift, and then on an issue by issue basis or a country by country basis, you have individuals that can steer policy in certain directions. Like I think it was Victoria Nuland in Ukraine is one of these hyper-powered individuals who was coordinating the Maidan protests with the Ukrainian opposition, working to get Yanukovych deposed. And that wasn't part of a large overarching Obama plan for dealing with Russia. He had talked about hitting the reset button, working together on issues in the Middle East. But in that case, the country level operative makes tactical decisions that then tie the hands of the strategic policymakers. Not that there was necessarily a better plan for Ukraine sitting in a Pentagon drawer, but the behavior of the empire isn't based on an established imperial plan, but involves a great deal of uncoordinated local level or politically motivated meddling, which
it's a kraken with brain damage. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Kraken with brain.
Yeah, excellent point. Jesus. Better put than I did. Yeah.
I think Iran is actually one of the areas that's very dangerous in terms of the U.S. empire being a threat to itself and others, because you have this state that, Iran could not beat the U.S. in a war, but it can do some serious damage. It could take a real bite out of, if they really just like went to war and flipped a switch, that would just set the entire Middle East on fire. And I think that you have this thing where the U.S. elite kind of really hates Iran with like an irrational, it's an emotional thing for them. It's like they can't get over getting embarrassed in 1979. And so you have an elite that's not thinking straight. You have an insane overconfidence. I mean, this is really a dangerous thing. I think that a lot of the American elite really believes it's a willpower problem, like genuinely believes that if we just showed a little bit more resolve in different countries, we can get what we want, that we're just holding back. That's the problem. And so you have a combination of like places like Iran where the US just irrationally hates it and also thinks it's just a matter of willpower. We can really take this on. I mean, that and the country could actually kick the US in the nuts, couldn't threaten the entire thing, but could do a lot of damage. I mean, that's dangerous, right? That's how you lead to something crazy like I don't even know what comparison to really make. And of course, going back to the JCPOA, I think part of the reason why an Iranian nuclear weapon would be so dangerous is not because the Iranians would do something stupid with it, but because the Americans might do something really stupid in response.
Yeah,
that's a very
1914 feeling about American foreign policy.
You said 1914. You said, Kuba?
Yeah, the where because of the level of delusion and the idea that will is what's missing, all of these comforting fables that the American foreign policy establishment tells about itself, and the desire to get some kind of redemption for the failure in Afghanistan, you could end up with a World War I type situation where the calculus that leads to large-scale conflicts is divorced from actual strategic thinking.
And the talking heads in the media establishment, like Anne Applebaum, like a hardcore Cold Warrior, she's like publishing articles today saying like the reason we lost Afghanistan was because we didn't believe in liberal democracy enough. You have what I like to call the 30 Rock Martyrs Brigade on MSNBC complaining that like like we failed and things like that. We can talk about like one of the things about the American withdrawal, one of the reasons it looks so bad is because the United States can't accept that it was defeated in Afghanistan. When you're defeated in a war, you go to the victors, you say, okay, we surrender. We want to get our prisoner exchanges. Let's do this in an orderly fashion. But because, of course, the United States can't admit that the war was lost, then you're not going to be able to have the orderly withdrawal that wouldn't look as disastrous as it does now. Because, again, America is in a delusional state. Iran, as Matthew said very correctly, is like they have no regime change plan. Who are they going to stick in there? Mujahideen Khalq, who are lunatics, right? The Shah people who have no social base and support. The Trump administration was so dangerous because they were like, oh, let's just turn it into Syria 2.0, because there's an enormous amount of social tension in Iran that could blow up, and there is genuine discontent at the regime for a multiplicity of reasons. But if that explodes, like we're going to see in a year, I believe, Afghan refugee flows coming into Europe and it being a disaster, right? You imagine what happens in Iran. Right? If Iran descends into God knows.
Let me ask this question to the panel again. So if we're going to see another large influx of refugees, a lot of them will most likely be Muslim into Europe, are we going to then see an increase in a right-wing ideology in those governments of those countries? Are we going to see a growth of Golden Dawn? Are we going to see a growth of right-wing reactionaries in Germany?
I just don't think they'll take the refugees. It'll be camps in Turkey forever. If you're lucky, you'll get to a Greek island where it'll be like the Nauru model that the Australians use.
The European political classes seem to just have a consensus, everyone but the far left, has a consensus of just like border imperialism, just churn all the weaker countries on Europe's doorstep into giant, like basically prisons for refugees. I mean, I think that is a process independent of American imperialism and its own Europe's own fucked up imperative. But I mean, they've been doing that for a long time now. They've churned a lot of like North Africa, and not just the ones right on the Mediterranean coast, like going deeper and deeper into Africa, strong arming these governments into serving as a border police, basically.
And let me add
what the United States has tried to do with Mexico, deputize Mexico as essentially a county jail for illegal immigrants. And I mean, there's something to be said for a policy that would foster development and stability in situ, so people didn't have to migrate, which is extraordinarily dangerous. And it's not fun being an immigrant in societies that don't want you, as I learned in the United States. So, but yeah, we seem to be hitting the worst possible outcome for migrants, in which you don't have the host country policies that would reduce pressure pushing people out. Instead, you just have systems of greater and greater repression and incarceration as you get closer to a destination country.
And I would add to this, for example, and I just want to ask Matthew this as well. I mean, you know, Turkey is going to be a huge player in stopping these refugee flows. And as you've noted in your research, you know, one of the destabilizing factors is the indulgence Turkey has shown in terms of its imperial adventures. Libya, Armenia, Syria, all places. In a sense, although Turkey is in an economically weak position, there's a lot of people saying that Turkey is at the behest of Qatar, which is bankrolling its economy. But this refugees issue is going to be a leverage point, which allows further destabilizing actions on the part of Turkey. And then obviously that's going to breed reactions. I believe some of the data you had in your report you did for Quincy, I think it shows like the latest numbers is that actually it's not even the UAE, it's like Turkey that's doing some of the highest amount of intervention. And this this refugee flow will benefit those countries like Turkey in that it will allow the people might go, oh no, it's really bad what they're doing, but like we also don't want 5 million Afghan, because Erdogan has threatened to turn the tap on whenever he wants. What's your thoughts on this?
I think Turkey, well, the deference to Turkey is kind of two different things. On one hand, you have a part of the kind of permanent U.S. imperial bureaucracy, like that's, nostalgic for NATO, very well integrated with the Turkish defense establishment that, likes Turkey as their favored client state. And, this is an internal factional thing. The the UAE-Turkey Cold War also leads to like a think tank Cold War in Washington. But the other half of that is the Europeans' weird contradictory relationship where they like to use Turkey as a punching bag. They like to, use Turkey as the big bad external demon, but they also like to pay Turkey off to use them as a refugee camp. And so, the Europeans also indulge and sell weapons they like tut-tut at Turkey, but they also indulge and sell weapons to them. In terms of the Turkey surpassing the UAE, I mean, the UAE and Turkey, basically what my research found, to step back, my research for the Quincy Institute, you always hear about different destabilizing powers in the Middle East and state-sponsored terrorism and all that, but I tried to basically quantify how many proxy wars is each state involved in any given year? How many conflicts is it directly involved in? How many armed groups is it supporting? And what I found is that, Iran is one of the most aggressive interveners, but so are Turkey and the UAE. And the pattern that unfolded was that the Iranians were actually the most aggressive in the first few years of the Arab Spring, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, trying to hold together their client states. The UAE steadily increased throughout the Arab Spring, as in places we don't really hear about so much, as they expanded, supported reactionary governments and, these kind of counter-terrorist mercenary forces that are fighting, these very gray area wars. And then Turkey recently has surpassed both of them because it's basically just, been unleashed. I think it's a combination of like domestic factors. It's really spooked by the growth of Kurdish nationalism. And it kind of sees these power vacuums as opportunities to build leverage in the same way that Iran and the UAE have. And of course, like we talked about a few minutes ago, it's been indulged by European states who, need Turkey as a external border police, and by elements of the American national security establishment who are nostalgic for this Turkey as a Cold War proxy.
And one consequence of the United States not engaging in direct imperialism or being in denial about its imperial role is that it depends on partners and local governments for the infrastructure that allow it to project power. Apart from the nostalgia there for Turkish, the golden days of Turkish NATO membership, there's also Interlink, right, which you need. That's a source of leverage. Similarly, the bases in and one thing that comes up a lot on a TIR foreign policy nights is the fact that the United States has this massive archipelago of bases across the world that allow it to project power into places like Afghanistan, which, if you think about it, is a landlocked country literally on the other side of the planet. But those bases it's a double-edged sword because they create leverage for the local regime. They create points of vulnerability where adversaries don't have to go all the way to New York to hit you. And with such visible and high-profile interventions as the American occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, the value of that infrastructure of empire becomes essential, right? It's no longer a nice to have. You need it to be able to get your people out of Kabul, be able to get your people out of Baghdad. And then you're limited in what you can say to Ankara. You're limited in how you can deal diplomatically with some of these kind of clients with their own, who have decided to do things their own way.
Who here knows that the U.S. has 50 nuclear weapons in a base in Turkey?
Are they still like the Jupiter rockets from the 1950s or something?
No, this is like an updated.
Yeah, they still have them.
That's worse. That's somehow worse.
Pascal?
Yeah, my question I want to ask is that since we're trying to really ascertain what the American vision in these regions really is, how much do we think that what American foreign policy has been reduced to at this stage pretty much comes down to China containment, or China and Russia containment, if you will? In other words, the concept of a kind of grander vision of American empire that perhaps was the case in the 50s under the Dulles brothers, or was exhibited by the British Empire in the age of Victoria, is gone. But now we're just like CYA all over the world because the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is on the rise. Do we think that perhaps that American empire has been reduced to covering its behind against a potentially rising counter hegemon, i.e. China and Russia? I'd like your thoughts. I'm not saying I have the answer, but I'd like to hear what you guys have to say.
You know that China does more business with the Gulf countries like, Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia than it does with Iran. So if it was really about China containment, I mean, first thing, like, we are the police force for Chinese investment in the Middle East. I think a lot of bureaucracies in different regions try to justify their own existence through China containment. But I don't think that's in practice necessarily what's happening, because not only is the U.S. kind of wasting its resources in the Middle East, but it's doing so in a way that actually protects Chinese economic interests.
Well, elaborate on that. That's an interesting little point there. The way America's dealing with itself in the Middle East protects Chinese economic interests. Can you give us an example, please?
Well, like I said, the Gulf countries do more business with China than Iran does. Like China buys their oil. China invests a crap ton, has a lot of investments in these countries, and these countries are guarded by American troops. So in a way, I mean, right, it's like we provide in the Middle East, it's a division of labor where, the U.S., provides security to these like international enclave port cities, which then, China basically invests freely in and buys freely from. And so I don't think they mind it. I think they're very happy that the U.S. is putting blood and treasure into protecting these states while allowing China to invest in them, because that's the free market.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up for that. Just one second. In terms of the Iran policy, then, we talked a lot about America, but to what extent then are countries like China and Russia playing a role in Iran? In terms of the Iran nuclear deal, everyone's like, oh, well, Iran might build a nuclear bomb, and there's an impeccable, entirely logical rationale for the Iranians to rush that bomb. Like my wife, went to school in Iran, and they maths the hell out of them. It's like, do the maths, learn maths, so you can build that bomb. She's really good at maths. But to what extent is, for example, China and Russia actually aligning to a certain extent with American policy, because they don't really want Iran to have a nuclear bomb either? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, China and Russia voted for the UN Security Council resolutions that put a lot of the sanctions on Iran during the Obama era, because you're right. They don't want the nuclear powers club. One of their most crucial interests is kind of nuclear stability, making sure that the number and arrangement of and number and distribution of nuclear weapons doesn't suddenly change. They like to keep this balance of deterrence, and they like to be the ones with the exclusive club that can actually do this. However, I think the Trump administration's maximum pressure has kind of pushed Russia and China more into Iran's corner, because they saw this as basically a bad faith. They saw the U.S. attention on Iran as not just a non-proliferation thing. It's actually just a backdoor to regime change. It's a bad faith effort. You saw this with the snapback sanctions, where so this is this complicated legal thing, but basically there's a mechanism in the Security Council where the U.S. can unilaterally, or any participant in the nuclear deal can unilaterally just throw out the deal if they say that Iran is not in compliance with it. The idea was basically to make it so that Iran can't cheat and then hide behind a veto power. But they can't just cheat and then hide behind Russia. But what happened is that when the U.S., when the Trump administration tried to activate this, the entire Security Council just said no. This is just null and void. They basically threw out the snapback mechanism because they thought it was a bad faith American move. Not only the Russians and Chinese, also the Europeans ignored it. The only country that supported the American position was the Dominican Republic. Because it's an American client state, et cetera. So I think that these two countries don't want Iran to get nuclear weapons. They want to preserve the current distribution of nuclear weapons. And I think they would start to get antsy if Iran really did rush to the bomb. But they also, I think, even worse, I think they consider American regime change operation that would be very destabilizing to be an even worse outcome. And so they're willing to side with Iran against that.
And I think that this points to a fundamental disconnect between different parts of the American kind of strategic foreign policy vision. There's all this talk about the rules-based international order. And one of the reasons why you have China and Russia and Europe all siding with Iran over the treaty is because those countries actually benefit from a rules-based international order and would like to see one in place. The rules-based if you're not the hegemon, then anything that constrains the use of hegemonic power and creates a regular, orderly, predictable system for you to operate in economically and strategically is beneficial. China likes having an open international economy where Huawei can sell phones wherever it wants, where it can source raw materials from wherever it wants. And the implicit deal of American unilateralism from the end of the Cold War on was that the United States will provide that stable, predictable, open international economy as long as you keep your mouth shut and let them do what they want. But what we're seeing is that there's also an element inside the American foreign policy circles that can't be trusted with that role and prefers to use unilateral force to reshape political conditions anywhere in the world to the way they like. And that's the part of it that's threatening to Russia and China. And you have this schizophrenia in American foreign policy, where on the one hand, the United States depends on China for so many imports, for so many semi-finished goods, for so many, for so much of its consumer base, and also as an export market. There's all kinds of economic interests that will push back against doing a real Chinese containment, but for lack of for an unwillingness to actually create a rules-based international order which would constrain American unilateral freedom of action, and you end up with these half measures where we're kind of containing China, but also we're actually being China's investment police in the Middle East. We're kind of containing China, but we're also keeping all of the trade routes through the South China Sea open that allow the Chinese economy to grow and for China to transfer capital and technology.
Kuba said China too much because the deep state just snuck up on him.
I'll be replaced by a clone soon enough.
Yeah. Well, and I guess I was just kind of like doubling down on what Matthew and Cuba have been saying, and because there's like an interesting, I think, conundrum within U.S. foreign policy, and something that you're hitting on as far as like the reliance on China's products, but within the military industry, it's, you know, some of the highest technological requirements for, you know, some of these things are actually, you know, like China is the, you know, like the only one that's able to produce some of these things reliably. I mean, I think it was, you know, sometime in the Biden administration, it might have been like a few months ago, starting directives of like, hey, how do we get our supply chain China free, you know, military wide is kind of like one of these goals. And that, I guess, you know, my question would be of with that kind of issue with China, you know, it kind of makes me think, you know, going back to, hey, you know, we have to take the L in Afghanistan, whereas somewhere else so we can, you know, flex the hegemonic muscle. They can't really touch China yet, you know, but there is that kind of goal to say like, we want to get to that point where we can get us some China.
Yeah, Obama was explicit about that. He said he called it the pivot to Asia, right? Like, and you know, military leaders are very explicit about that. Like, we want to move resources out of the Middle East and to East Asia. That being said, I don't think China wants to be I don't think the Chinese elite wants to be the Soviet Union. I think they're very happy with this idea of, you know, make a lot of money within the U.S.-led order and then just like kind of slowly buy it out from the U.S., like gradually, you know, just let the U.S. I think Trump kind of threw a wrench into that in a way because he made it an open conflict, and that has led the Chinese elite seems to have gotten very cocky about their ability to take the U.S. now, but I don't think this was what they've wanted. And I'm sure there are also factions in that, which somebody else can speak
Is it kind of like they're the good cop in a lot of ways? Like there was no like deal like for the U.S. like, hey, China, we're going to play good cop, bad cop. But in a way, like they've become
the good. I mean, if you're a country in Africa and you have a choice between the exploitative financial institutions of the West,
history of
and
knowing
the Chinese building a railway but not transferring technology. At least you get a railway at the end of it. It's not too bad. And with the China conflict, I mean, we have to understand, like, and this may sound a bit heavy Marxism for the morning, but we have different sections of the bourgeoisie in the United States. So obviously you have the military-industrial complex, which has a vested interest, at the very least, of playing up the Chinese threat in order to extract resources from the state to purchase fighters, weaponry, and all those kind of things that you can both sell to the U.S. military, but also sell to U.S. client states in East Asia, so on and so forth. But then you also have elements of the commercial bourgeoisie that want to go to China. If everybody remembers, Bloomberg, of all people, was saying that China is not a dictatorship, and people got mad at him. But of course, Bloomberg's going to say that because the commercial bourgeoisie, I mean, China is one of the major nodes in the global capitalist system, critical to global capitalist production. So elements of the commercial bourgeoisie want to maintain access to the Chinese market, to cheap Chinese labor. I went to the grand opening of Costco in Springfield, Missouri yesterday, and when I drove back,
that's a big day in Missouri.
Big day in Springfield.
Yeah. I made a meme about the Bloomberg thing. I just retweeted it if anyone wants to see.
Oh, there's a meme about it. But when I drove back, I stopped at the railway crossing, and you can see all the giant Costco containers. Everything product of China, right? Everything product of China. So there are competing forces within the American ruling class over what a China policy would look like, because there is a lot of push from the commercial wings of the bourgeoisie to maintain the kind of era of cooperation, because those markets are just too valuable, and pissing off China too much means that you might get excluded from the Chinese market, which is what you don't want to do.
I want to interject here if possible. What exactly does?
Hold on, Pascal, can you hold on that question 1 second? I think this is something we have to address and kind of stop talking about it. We've talked about it before, and actually, Pascal, you brought this up. It's a news story again that there's a bunch of minerals in the ground in Afghanistan, and that was the whole plan all along, to get these minerals out of the earth. Kuba, did you want to address that again?
Yeah, I've looked at the numbers because when I was working for the Department of Defense, there were some Afghanistan projects that crossed my desk, different proposals for stabilization operations, and there are minerals in Afghanistan, and they would be discussed in these plans as a potential source for economic growth, as a potential way to sort of offset the costs of the U.S. operations there. And even in the most optimistic scenario, where you're able to invest on the cheap, and the security situation works itself out, and you get all of these multipliers with commercial trade and growth in allied industries, as well as the value of the minerals. It's just not worth it. It is a trivial gain compared to the costs of doing the infrastructure work, doing the security work, doing the invasion. And that's assuming that you can even actually get at the minerals, because most large-scale infrastructure operations in Afghanistan, they were preempted by security concerns, right? If the Taliban controls the province, you're not building a lithium mine. And so there was never really an economic rationale for
if I really quick, just to the maximum extent would be, there is an example of former President Gandhi's brother like holding like 20% stake in like in a company, but like these were things that on the local level were like a basis of like part of the corruption issue, but not breaking through to, hey, we are now utilizing this in the American market type of thing, you know? So yeah, that's where it's like, oh yeah, we're going there for the oil. No.
I had a question I wanted to ask. We talk about we're in this kind of conundrum in terms of American empire. What is the fact that we have this kind of reactionary right that's rising not only in American politics but in most major Western centers? What does that foretell for the overall strategic vision in these countries for foreign policy overall? What exactly can we expect? How will this affect the paradigm?
Can I pick up on that? Because I don't have an answer so much as something that I'd like to add to the question, which is you have this rise of right-wing nationalism in the United States and elsewhere. How much of that is related to the costs that the United States pays, especially the sort of working class population, the family and communities that soldiers and contractors come from? There's a serious human toll that comes out of being used as a soldier, you know, doing the imperial work. That also undermines your ability to compete with China, and that changes your politics domestically. It creates more pressure to try to shift resources away from empire into the local population, and it creates too really intense cleavages between different political and cultural segments within the country. So to Pascal's question, is the nationalism going to make for a more aggressive or changed foreign policy, and what's the toll on the United States that comes out of 20 years of this losing war on terror?
You should really bring Spencer Ackerman on your show, because his book Reign of Terror basically makes the case that, like, you know, in the American right, you have the nativists are always a pretty big faction, people who are not necessarily, you know, George H.W. Bush New World Order types, but, you know, just maximum you know, just jingoistic and kind of inward looking, but also like outward shows of strength. And what happened is that the kind of civilizational aspect of the war on terror, this whole like Islamophobia stuff, brought in the nationalist right, but now they've been frustrated from, and also grown out of the frustration of basically the realization that there is no victory, no defeat, that this is, you know, endless, that the war that they bought into actually, it turns out not to be like a grand crusade, but just endless imperial maintenance. And so a lot of this like right-wing resurgence is just like looking for, like, QAnon. What is the fantasy of QAnon? It's like the fantasy that the good deep state is going to overthrow the bad deep state in this grand anti-pedophile uprising. Like, it's after, you know, 20 or 30 years of imperial maintenance that doesn't seem to have an end. They're looking for some kind of resolution, some kind of grand resolution, and not even looking at external enemies anymore, but kind of collapsing inwards.
Yeah, I think that there's been a reorientation of anger and rage from and you know, if you were around September 11th, you felt this generalized anti-Muslim rage. And there's been a reorientation of that away from the kind of Toby Keith, you know, we put a boot in your ass, it's the American way, to this QAnon and MAGA type, American versus American, blue versus red, elite versus deplorables type of cleavage.
I feel like it is just more complicated, you know, and like I don't even know if I have, you know, a great like solidified thought on it, but it's just a little bit more complicated where they're like like Trump, where he kind of like guessed right with what was popular and what it was it's phrased with like the Iraq War. Some of this, hey, we need to not worry about what's going on over there, or worry about like what's going on with our own country. Kind of just like a nationalistic take. And like focus on like, we just need to get the Americans out, and like whatever happens to the rest of them, whatever. But then also there is this dangerous BLM critical race theory, cabal that is poisoning, our society. And I like, honestly, I don't know even like what point I'm trying to make, other than like the right is, and even in some case, kind of like eating itself, while it's also eating, like as, the part of the American public that's also eating the American public.
Yeah, but aren't they actually being successful because of their capture of state capitals throughout the country and their ability to implement this vision? They also control the judiciary. I mean, we can laugh and snicker and and kiki about the reactionary right and their ridiculous cartoonish QAnon fantasies and everything else, but they're actually implementing their strategic vision politically through state legislatures in about 20 some odd, if not more, state legislatures in the country. And they still control the judiciary. And right now, the liberals are not looking that good with this Afghanistan thing.
I mean, at this point, the culture wars is more real than the war on terror.
Let's talk about the war on terror in a moment, but I would like have a kind of concluding thought for that. Matthew raised a really good point about the Trump administration a while back, and I think it's important to circle back to that point, was that Trump was not against wars, he was against dumb wars, right? And, a lot of pseudo anti-war policy is not actually anti-war policy. It is a debate over imperial strategy. And the strategic vision, however primitive, that was articulated by the Trump administration was not an anti-intervention policy. It was a imperial strategy policy, that we need to have better imperial strategy, and we need to move away from this dumb stuff. In fact, it is a more realistic perception of both what America does in the world and how Americans are perceived outside of the world. America first is like, look, America is a country. America has to put its interests first. Other countries are going to try and put their interests first. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there. Let's start acting like it. Whereas the Biden administration has a kind of a nostalgic delusion that the world sees, like everybody in the world sees America as this indispensable power. And perhaps there was some more validity to that view in the 1990s, especially in European capitals, but also in other capitals in the world that saw that, East Asia, whether or not we like America, they show the only way. But the war on terror has fundamentally sort of, the 20 years that have taken place in this war of terror have like radically altered the ideological superstructure of the global order, as well as like how powers view America. My question for Matthew is kind of a big meta question. It's like, what is the meaning of the war on terror, and how would you place it in historical context?
Yeah, I mean, I've been tossing around an essay about this. I'm not sure if I'm going to publish it or anything, but, well, also I do want to say, though, the Bidenite vision of, like, there are people in the Middle East who actually do, like you said, the Shah people in Iran don't have a social base. No, there are actually Iranians who have this fantasy of the U.S. is going to swoop in and establish a kind of Jeffersonian democracy with the Shah at the head of it. Like, there are people who watched the humanitarian interventions go badly and concluded, like, wait, we need this for our country. Like, the Americans will come beat up our oppressors for us. But I think in general, the meaning of the war on terror, I mean, like, American post-World War II ideology has been, Gigi, thank you for the compliment on my eyebrows in the comment. Yeah, the American post-World War II ideology has really been based around, like, it's been based around World War II. It's been based on the idea that the old world is full of totalitarians. We need to dominate it and constantly, fight an existential threat against some totalitarian power to, like, free the world. That was the same running assumption through the Cold War. And then there was kind of a hiatus where like you had this vague humanitarian intervention stuff where we're going to fight authoritarians or something, but this end of history stuff that wasn't really satisfying. And then the war on terror actually did provide like a civilizational struggle again, like, Islamofascism. And I think like a lot of what's going on with Iran is really just trying to like recover that. Like here's a ideological power that we can really, fight to the death with them. But it's like kind of falling apart because there is no ideological struggle. There is no satisfying ending. It's just kind of endless imperial management and a war that, endless. When people say endless war, it's not the same thing as forever war. Endless doesn't mean that there's no end in time. As we see with Afghanistan, it can end in time suddenly, but endless isn't like it's not going towards anything. There's no end. There's no goal. It's just maintenance of the empire. You see kind of these liberal attempts to like talk about like an authoritarian axis as an attempt to kind of resurrect that, but it's just not landing anymore. And I think the right-wing reactionary, as I said before, and as Spencer Ackerman has made the point of, it's like it's frustration with endless war and trying to get some kind of grand resolution like America used to have.
And I think that if you have a claim to global leadership and you also have a self-impression as a nation of virtue, then there are a limited number of justifications that you can make for exercising authority. One is we'll make the world a better place. But 20 years of the war on terror falsified that. We have torture prisons in Guantanamo Bay that are still open. The United States shredded a great deal of international law and opened up a new age of violence through the war on terror. Well, then another possible justification is, well, we can't make the world a better place, but we need to preserve the goodness of America, which is exceptional and unique. But the cost of the war on terror hasn't just been borne by Iraqis and Afghanis, but also the luster of the American model, the American economic model, the American political model has worn off because of the visible inequality, the misery that exists in U.S. society, the police killings of unarmed civilians, the level of political division and instability within the United States has likewise killed the appeal of the model. So what is there left? You either need to, and this is the last refuge of any foreign policy wonk in DC, when you point out all the problems with American hegemony, they're like, well, do you want the Chinese in charge? Do you want the Russians in charge? And at this point, it's like, maybe, I don't know, right? Like, what's the offer?
Can be worse.
Yeah, exactly. Like if Xi Jinping is willing to, just make sure that the internet doesn't get censored for the stuff I like, and that, the Dalai Lama can still appear in the occasional Buddhist documentary, I'd probably be fine with that. So now,
how many weddings are going to get drone striked? Like that's, can we deal with that?
We got this super chat we got to deal with here from Billy St. Ampere. Does keeping U.S. income involved in foreign entanglements keep people focused on supposed geopolitical economic threats instead of capital itself? That's an interesting question. Another super chat. Largely, the WOT ended up as a kleptocratic grift by the war on terror. Okay, a kleptocratic grift by the industrial military complex, not by design.
I think it was by design.
There was some design.
I think it was by design.
There was some design. You look at these people in the military, and then Kuba and Matthew probably have a greater familiarity with these fellows than any of us have. But there's people making money. You look at the media narrative, and people are like, well, the Afghans did it to themselves. And I'm not here to defend the kleptocratic Afghan political class. But if you want to talk about where all that money turned up, you need to go look in Northern Virginia and see all these like mansions that are being constructed from contractors and people who
Raytheon Acres.
Raytheon Acres. I mean, what are your thoughts? I mean, what are your thoughts on this question, particularly about the role of the military-industrial complex in the war on terror? Was it a play, Matthew? Do you see it as being at least to some degree by design, or was this just a grift that grew out of something else?
Man, let me just also say on the whole, like, oh, Afghans didn't fight thing, like, that really pisses me off to hear. This was Afghanistan was in a civil war that, like, hundreds of people were dying every month under, both from ground combat and also American airstrikes. So when people say, oh, this was sustainable indefinitely, or, why didn't we keep U.S. troops there to delay the fall of the Kabul government? Oh, the Afghans didn't fight. I mean, as someone on Chapo, I forgot who said, like, you're just asking Afghans to die en masse in their own civil war so that you can feel better. I mean, this isn't directed at Eugene. This is directed at, like, the kind of... Yeah,
those hot, spicy takes that are just...
And certain people who, Matthew knows who I'm talking about, masquerade as socialist leftists on Twitter, when in fact they're advocating like totally nonsense stuff.
No, yeah, I mean, there's this whole like humanitarian appeal of like this whole narrative that they're trying to construct of like white
women.
Yeah, no, but also white leftists are talking over local voices, but like, local voices who show up on TV cameras. There's no reckoning at all for the costs in human life of the kinds of people who don't get invited to think tanks, don't get media spots. All this horrible violence was happening off camera, and there was no consideration for Afghan lives or the humanitarian situation. Anyways, I'm not going to derail this.
Well, let me before we get to the super chat, let me derail it even more. Marcus mentioned the women. I visited my father the other day. That's not super politically involved, but he definitely brought that whole issue up about the U.S. was good for women in Afghanistan, the Middle East in general, because that seems to be kind of a theme. And this question goes to the panel as a whole. And I will start with you, Matthew. What is your take when you hear that narrative that this is going to be horrible for women and the U.S. was great for women in places like Afghanistan?
Well, it will be a setback for women. I mean, both the Taliban and the U.S.-backed warlords were pretty bad, but at least under the U.S.-backed regime, there were urban enclaves where women did make progress. I think we can't look away from this or deny it. But I also, do think that we need to pay attention to the human suffering for men and women and children that's happening away from the cameras as the civil war is raging on. And, there's also child sex abuse was very endemic among these warlords, and this never gets talked about in a humanitarian way. And I'm not trying to do whataboutism. I think
can you expand on that? Because again, this is part of the narrative that isn't really talked about. And want to expand on that.
Well, yeah, and I think Matthew just even you can keep going, but this is not whataboutism, but there's just a lot of nuance and details that people just leave out that do not tell the whole story. Because really, the story of the United States and Afghanistan, it doesn't start 20 years ago. It starts from 40 years ago, and without having that full context to say this is where too for one, 6 months in to the war in Afghanistan, you already have Donald Rumsfeld meeting with talking with the top generals saying we don't know where the bad guys are, and at that point they start crafting these other reasons why we need to be there. One was to start their own democratic nation state. Another was, hey, can we get these cultural shifts within women and girls starting to learn and have more rights and everything like that, completely ignoring the fact that if we rewind all the way and stop any U.S. intervention in the first place, Afghani women and children are doing, and men, old people, everything are undeniably doing way better than they are right now after U.S. intervention in any way possible. And that's the real lesson. Because
I don't want to defend the Soviet war either. That was very brutal. I think.
Yes. Well, yeah. Not to give. Yes. And this is definitely not a, hey, Soviets can do, yes, that intervention in general, right? Imperialism in general, bad.
I think it's like all very grim. It's all very grim. These are all the actions for the past 40 years have been extremely blood soaked. And I think we shouldn't deny that the Taliban advance is going to be bad for women. I think what I'm just saying is like there's no real reckoning with the cost. It's like maintaining these like urban enclaves, which are more progressive than the rest of the country. Like nobody wants to even talk about what was happening in the countryside, the cost at which this war was being fought in terms of death, in terms of sexual abuse, in terms of all sorts of hellish social structures that were being propped up by this war.
Well, my position on the situation with the women is that regardless of the Taliban being quote unquote sexist or misogynistic, we do know that they won't have to worry about getting droned out of their lives by the U.S. dropping bombs on them anymore, which I think would be a little bit more of a greater hazard or something to worry about for all kinds of like women or otherwise who are having their kids, decimated by drone warfare. So, I mean, my position is not that, the Taliban does not have obvious problems with its gender comportment, but I would also agree with Marcus in terms of what is the United States' role in creating the chain of events that leads here going back to 79. And I think that, when we look back in those equations, not that, it was completely paradise under the role of the Soviet Union, but one of the things that caused the Soviet Union to want to intercede in that country was the fear of U.S. involvement in terms of intelligence in other ways with the Mujahideen as well. So my position is that the downward spiral of what Afghanistan became or becomes now in terms of the treatment of its women and treatment of society overall cannot be disconnected by the role of American interventionism, not necessarily going back 20 years, but as Mark stated, going back 40 years plus.
I would just like to add to that. I think it's Afghanistan is a lesson in the way that external military intervention from whoever it is often has a deleterious effect on the society. The Soviet Afghanistan had a revolution in the late 1970s, and the Soviets were very reticent about becoming involved in Afghanistan. But they rolled in. It was an invasion because I don't know what you call a military operation where you roll in the country and execute the head of state. Kind of sounds like an intervention. The socialist regime or the kind of socialist adjacent regime that took power implemented many very important social reforms to the country, no doubt. But at the end of the day, it was also a top-down revolution, which involved a lot of violence, a lot of purging, and also the liquidation of the very social base that had made that revolution possible. People forget it's actually very similar to the Syrian civil war. You had a civil war developing in the country with many different factions, from Maoists to Muslim Brotherhood types to all these groups that were alienated by the Kabul regime. And then as the war progressed, the most reactionary elements of that movement survived and were obviously facilitated by the United States, but also as I think this is really important with Matthew's research, but also regional actors who are acting in their own interest, like Pakistan, just as countries like Turkey and the UAE have their own policies that make situation work. Pakistan and other powers became involved. The US became involved. And we have a long history of external conflict, which is just aggravated. I mean, one of the things that Matthew points out in his research is that, these interventions end up making the civil wars longer, right? They end up dragging them out. And this is what happened in Afghanistan with both the Soviet intervention and both the U.S. intervention, is that a civil war that took place, that began in the late 1970s, has been dragged out for a generation and a half.
I want to a little on what Gene said as I kind of make my explanation. And if you want to improve the status of women in a society, if you want to introduce democracy or lead to some kind of other social change from a human rights angle, and you're doing an intervention for it, then you have to think about how you're going to interface with the society, how you're going to make policy changes, how you're going to impose impose the adjustments, right? Like, or introduce the ideas, introduce the laws that you want. And for that, you need a state, right? You need a state apparatus. You need bureaucracies. You need police. You need administration. And the American way of fighting conflicts involves decapitation strikes against leadership positions, the degradation of command and control centers, and the destruction of infrastructure that is essential to military logistics and operations. Then the United States likes to purge the old regime, as they did with de-Baathification in Iraq. You're destroying the very structure of administration and authority that you need to make the changes that you want stick. And in that case, these humanitarian interventions are fool's errand. If you capture the state, right, you execute the leadership, but you keep the apparatus of control intact, then you can introduce changes like after World War II. But the way that the United States fights, you destroy the incumbent systems of power, then you introduce exiles, foreigners, people with no social base to come in and, you know, out of those ashes without any domestic resources, stand up new systems of power. And you don't even commit enough troops so that the occupation itself could be an apparatus of effective power and administration. You're guaranteed to just be sowing chaos. And in that chaos, on an individual level, case by case, some people may be better off because the old system just was a boot on their throat. And now, if they can navigate the instability, they have some more opportunities. But in general, you're taking countries and you're turning them into war zones without and destroying the means that you need to end those wars.
Yeah, I mean, really well said. I think I wanted to say that one of the worst things you can do to a country is prolong a civil war. Like, civil wars are really, this is what I mean by like nobody looks at the cost. Like, this is, Americans love the idea of like resistance and holding out and all this stuff, but like prolonging a civil war unleashes all sorts of horrible social forces that are very hard to come back from. The way you describe regime change, I mean, that's the problem, right? What are the tools of empire, particularly American empire, for changing regimes? You smash up the state structure at random, then you bring in people who don't have a social base. I mean, I don't want to say like let's do a more effective empire, but
if you're going to do it, then you need for it to succeed.
It's not that we're saying it's good. It's just like
this is the worst of all.
We're bad at it. You know, like the United States is really bad at it.
We gotta take this super chat. What the person is asking, this is from Charles Raintree. Would I be showing my tinfoil hat too much if I asked you to talk about the project for the new American century in relationship to the Middle East conflicts? Tinfoil hat on, Charles Raintree.
Matthew, do you want to take this one?
Yeah. Wow, this is a real Bush administration throwback.
Yeah, it is a throwback.
It's like there's no conspiracy. Like think tanks, Washington D.C. elite, they talk about, you know, plans and intentions like quite openly. Like, and I mean, PNAC. I'm not super familiar with that history. I don't know if Kubo wants to tackle that, but there's a lot of different things.
Define what the project for the new American century was. Anyone want to tackle that?
Yeah. Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith, Rumsfeld, Cheney, they all had a deeper history of Republican bureaucratic executive branch service. And these think tanks are partly just holding patterns for old apparatchiks to sharpen their agendas for their next opportunity to go in and administer policy. The project for the New American Century was this outfit for essentially Reagan-era Republican hawks that weren't down with multilateralism and had mouths to feed in the military-industrial complex. So, and the thing about being out of power too is you can say things much more clearly than you can if you're part of an administration who's going to be quoted in the Washington Post. So we have all of these records about plans for regime change in Iraq, regime change in Iran, elsewhere, that really serve as a kind of template for the global war on terror. And like Matt said, it's not a conspiracy because it's out in the open. We have the minutes, right?
Yeah.
To add to that, I just want to add something quickly. Sorry, Matthew. Just to trigger Pascal a little bit. Part of the origins of this neoconservative term was in Trotskyism, within the disillusionment of, because Pascal sees Trotskyists as the worst. But you have this
you putting words in my mouth now. I'm the non-sectarian leftist. Remember?
That's true. Oh yes, but there were a faction of Trotskyists who basically got from being kind of international socialists became like internationalist liberals, right? So they kind of like adopted the Trotskyist internationalism, and I'm not putting this on all Trotskyists or things like that, but they basically took the Trotskyist international formula where you could like export revolution, but put it in the believed it to be a kind of liberal political project where you could export the liberal revolution around the world. I just wanted to add that about some bizarre origins of the neocon movement with these kind of former Trotskyists.
By the way,
I think that is a little overstated, though, because I mean, a lot of these.
It is a little overstated. Yeah, you're right. Continue.
Yeah, like a lot of these guys came out of like City College in New York when Trotskyism was like really dominant there, or from this kind of 1930s immigrant Jewish Italian kind of milieu where Trotskyism was like a big thing, but like also a lot of them were just like old Cold Warrior wasps who thought America's hands were tied. Like I think the Trotskyism thing, but just going back to like, it's not a conspiracy if it's out in the open. I think people do get conspiratorial about think tanks because they don't understand exactly what they know, that these are powerful institutions, but they don't understand exactly how their power functions. So they get kind of conspiratorial, but the thing is that their power functions by being out in the open. They write these policy papers as basically an advert. Think tanks are basically like the reserve bureaucracy of the American empire, right? It's where experts who would be in government, because we privatize everything. It's people who are either training to be in government or, their faction lost and now they're out of government, kind of in this reserve collection tank, no pun intended, where they sit or bounce around their ideas. And then if another administration that wants to use one of those ideas, comes around, then they'll pluck them out of the think tanks and give them a government post. And then when that administration loses the election, those people might be, out of government, and they go back to the think tank as like it's just like the reserve bureaucracy. So it's not.
We haven't really defined. Well, people are asking, well, what the hell was this thing? The Project for a New American Century was a think tank that promoted a document. I forgot the actual name of the document, which basically says that the United States needs a singular event, a global conflagration, to reorganize its place in the world in the coming century in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union, so that it can maintain its place as the hegemon of power. And many people who are conspiracy theorists believe that it was forecasting the need for September 11th. So that is why it's considered to be a tinfoil hat conspiracy theory document, even though it actually did exist as a document.
Yeah, and
quiet.
Well, and part of the vision of the Project for a New American Century was also that the United States wasn't just to be the hegemon, but it was to be absolutely unlimited in its expression of unilateral power. That neither alliances nor multilateral institutions nor international law were to impinge on the American transformation of human civilization through righteous violence, which ends up being what they try in Iraq, right? And they don't like the Afghanistan war because Afghanistan is not going to prove them right. It's not good material for the transmutation. While the alchemy is supposed to be better in Iraq.
And William Crystal is now supporting liberals. Go figure.
Yeah, and I was just saying, like the world police need qualified immunity, and that's basically what the U.S. expect.
Rules-based order. We rule, you take orders. This is based.
Yes, yep. That's perfect.
I like that. That's a good one. Rules-based order. We rule, you take orders, and this is based.
Yeah, people should check out Matthew's Twitter. Everybody should follow him on Twitter because he's pretty funny on Twitter. He's definitely got that Gen Z pizzazz on Twitter, so you gotta love it.
It's called shit posting, Gene. Get with it.
Bro, I went on your Twitch and I nearly had like an epileptic fit. I was like, I was like, what is this, man? I'm getting old. I mean, like, I don't know how you guys do it.
And like that's if you go to a gaming Twitch stream,
it's even
like you might go blind.
Yeah, it's just epilepsy.
It is
that comment, Matthew, is about you, apparently.
Oh, you're very sharp and a babe. You hear that, man?
And a babe.
Yeah, normally we don't have guests on that are prettier than me. So you're lucky that you made it through, Matthew. It's all right. All right. It's one time.
Marcus with the totally unjustified sense of self-absorption.
Pascal, somebody wants me to go on Joe Rogan.
Jason, go on Joe Rogan to do what? Compare music?
I have no idea.
You should go on Joe Rogan.
Arm wrestling match.
Yeah,
the sound guy. Work on the sound.
Hey, it would be good for
I hear he has great ayahuasca.
I think Joe Rogan has done drugs that even I've never heard of.
Yes.
If Rogan invited us on the show, I would go.
They didn't say us, Pascal. It was Jason.
Oh, someone said suggestions.
Just like when you go on Brianna Joy Gray show, it's just Pascal.
Oh, wow. Now we're getting behind. Now he's got some trouble in paradise.
I think you should go.
What do you think, Matthew?
You ever seen that meme that's like Joe Rogan is like some Mongolian Khan from the steppe who took an interest in intellectual things, and he's bringing slightly nervous magicians to come before him and explain the world. Bless his man. You explain to Joe why sky is big and how tree grow.
Yeah. So this is something that was like interesting with Joe Rogan is that like where like Bernie Sanders, like when in front of him was like, if you can explain it to him simply, he's like, yeah, if you can make it make sense for him. And also if like someone that around him, because they like every once in a while it's like, oh, this sounds kind of weird. Can you Google that for me? As long as they can Google it real quick and say, oh yeah, you're right. Like, boom, you have now solidified a thought in Joe Rogan's brain.
I mean, he's just
Gwyneth
Paltrow for Matt. He's Gwyneth Paltrow for Matt.
Yes. Yep.
Generally speaking, I'm super pessimistic about world peace. But I think the best shot that we have is if we can get Xi Jinping to go on a road trip with Joe Rogan. Like motorcycles through the desert, different mind-expanding drug.
Hunting bison together.
Yeah, but like in a very respectful, use every part kind of way. Help Xi Jinping process some PTSD,
Yeah, but I'm picturing
hugs.
I'm picturing all this through like the Winnie the Pooh cartoon where like Joe Rogan's there and then Xi Jinping is, Winnie and like going on all these like, epic adventures.
They should just Joe Rogan and
came back. We'd have fixed everything.
I think so.
I ran into Joe Rogan once in San Francisco, and he was a little shorter than I thought.
He's a little dude.
What do you guys think about bringing Bernard Henri Levy onto Joe Rogan's show?
Oh my God, that would be ridiculous.
Yeah, that would be funny. That would actually be funny.
He is literally the worst.
Yeah, that look of incomprehension. And it would be great because there would be a moment where Joe Rogan is like, "Oh wait, you're just full of shit." That's what's happening here. I thought I was dumb, but you're just full of shit.
Yeah.
That's the best part of Joe Rogan when he has certain people on. Like, honestly, his show to me, and I don't listen to it really that much. I haven't heard it in years, but when he would have like comedians on, I always thought it was interesting. But when he has people like these, what do you call them, intellectual dark web people, that's hilarious because he does. When that shit clicks in his head, when these people, he realizes they're full of shit, is always hilarious to me. Like when he realized Jordan Peterson was full of shit, but the equality of outcome, that was perfect.
I mean,
there is a moniker of sense within Joe Rogan. It's just not a lot of critical thought.
he's just a normal dude. He's actually like a good American. I mean, he's super rich, but he does kind of, I think, reflect the incoherent political instincts of
him.
LME asked in the comments, what full of shit is Bernard Henri Levy? He's like a French philosopher, like typical French philosopher guy. He likes to like button his shirt all the way.
Unbutton his shirt, yep.
And he's like the kind of liberal interventionist. Like he just finds causes that are that he likes to back and call for U.S. intervention. Usually dooms them. Like
I actually have a story. I was speaking to a Kurdish official, in the Kurdish, because he backed the Kurdish referendum for independence. And I was like, I don't think this is going to go well. Turkey's not going to accept this things. And the guy was literally, we have Levi Strauss backing us. It means that the West is backing us. I was like, I don't know if that's accurate, but things didn't go well with the Iraqi Kurdish referendum for independence. But Levi Strauss got a lot of expensive dinners at the Erbil Sheraton Hotel, where Kuba and I actually met. Kuba and I met at the Erbil Sheraton Hotel.
After the world's experience with Foucault and Derrida, are people still listening to French philosophers? I mean, really?
Bro, you should have read the latest nonsense that Zizek was writing about Afghanistan. I think his argument comes down to I sent you the article this morning, but
this article for the show.
It's so totally ridiculous. It's we missed the idea that they have martyrdom, and martyrdom is what are you talking about?
Listen, relax, Jim, because you're gonna be breaking some people on the left's heart. Making fun of Zizek.
Talking about
I've had dinner with Zizek. He's a perfectly nice gentleman.
You just pissed in a lot of people's cornflakes right now. I just want
I probably pissed in. I pissed in Doug.
A lot of cornflakes.
Let me add on that Zizek thing. That just reminds me of a point I wanted to make. Is there's the American right narrative on ending endless wars has just become these Arabs aren't ready for democracy or something. It's no, if you literally destroy a country. If you incite a civil war anywhere in the world, it's not going to be conducive to democracy. But so the Zizek the Afghans are ready for more. No, it's not that some kind of
It's not rocket science. Guess what? After the American Civil War, the Americans, especially in the southern states, were definitely not ready for democracy because those
say it again for the people in the back.
I mean, I'm just saying they basically created Rhodesia until about 1960. So civil wars create polarization that becomes very difficult to overcome because people are legitimately upset, and this country is no different. And Americans, when they talk about democracy, it's even in the liberal democratic sense of the word, America has been a democracy since 1968, right? Even in the liberal democratic sense of the word. There's no getting around it. If you have an entire racial group excluded, whether de facto or de jure, from political power, then it's not a democracy. And frankly, Americans' constitutional order may have been progressive in 1776, but it's nearly 300 years later. It's a pretty.
How was it even progressive in 1776 when even most white men didn't get a chance to vote till 1850s?
I mean, compared to autocratic France. I mean, you're not up against that much opposition, right? It's
I think when it comes to civil wars, American or otherwise, the American imagination is so deeply wedded to a majoritarian notion of democracy and the experience of living in a functional state that in some ways people imagine that because the Taliban won, that means most Afghans, like voted with their feet or bullets or whatever, that there's some popular element to outcomes in civil conflicts. And the reality is that, and Antonio Giustozzi had a fantastic book on this called The Art of Coercion, that if you have the breakdown of a state, so you're no longer in law and order, then what matters is the ability to mobilize violent men and have them disciplined and under orders. And if you can do that better than your rivals, you win. Nothing else matters. And the Taliban was very good at that. And when you have reconstruction or any effort to try to remake a political order, then your enemies are not going to try to outvote you. They're going to accumulate the apparatus of coercion. They're going to organize the men who can do violence, and you better be better at it than they are.
I want to address this question from the OG, Janice Graham. Shout out to Janice Graham for watching the show. Thank you very much. While we have Matt and Kuba, breaking news, ISIS now a threat at Kabul airport. View?
Yeah, I was just Googling that right now. I mean, what was said, the Taliban are telling people that you need to get away from Kabul airport because ISIS is planning an attack. I don't know if this is truthful or if this is some ploy to clear out crowds or something. I mean, ISIS exists in Afghanistan and they're like bitter enemies of the Taliban. Yeah, so we'll have to see what happens. I think in general, like
I was going to say like if the best way to think about it is like if you told everyone in like the DC metro area that anyone that worked for the federal government needed to leave. Like anyone that worked for the U.S. federal government has to leave the DC metro area. What would the operation look like as far as getting everyone out? And I say, hey, if you want to go to Reagan and Dulles to just because you want to take a vacation, hey, no, only these people with these certain identifications get through. And I mean, like, this is like oversimplification, but like at that point, there's like you have these mass migration of people moving to this one place, to the one place they can get out. A few different, when we're talking about Marines, Army, and then, I guess whatever state apparatus, and then also the Taliban and whatever the fuck that's going on. But I think even with this like CNN videos of that reporter like literally almost getting attacked, is that like at this point the Taliban is operating like any state military apparatus, at least like those forces where you got to keep the foot soldier in line. But the overall stated orders is like, hey, anyone with these secret credentials can come through. But there's a whole fuck ton of chaos. Like, this whole point is like we're saying is like, if you do this large scale warfare within a country, the only result that's guaranteed is chaos.
Yeah, this is what like losing a war / I don't want to call them a revolution. I mean, it's dignifying the Taliban, but I mean, it's like a post-revolutionary situation. They didn't really besiege Kabul. They just came in and swept out the old government. This is what a post-revolutionary situation looks like. Like it's nasty and chaotic.
Khmer Rouge vibes and
Khmer Rouge vibes. You said?
Yeah,
that's some big words there, man.
Yeah,
well,
that's gonna happen.
I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen, but there's a very broad range of possible outcomes. And the Khmer Rouge emptied Phnom Penh when they captured the city.
Yeah,
they said that the Americans were going to bomb it, I think, and they forced everyone out, and then they sorted people based on ideological considerations, and most of them ended up dead. The population of the capital city. And there's I don't know what the Taliban is doing off camera. The Afghan warfare is not just violent in combat, but there's especially during the long Civil War, the nature of the treatment of prisoners, the treatment of subject people, was horrifying from all sides. So there's a risk that this sounds to me like it could be a pretext to move people away from the places where they're kind of surveilled by the world into areas where they can be more easily processed. But I just don't know what's going to happen next. Anything I think is still possible.
Well, before we go, since Kuba is going to leave us on that cheery note, Matthew, do you have anything you wanted to promote or let us know what you're up to?
Yeah, so I'm leaving the DC think tank and journalism world for a bit to study Arabic. Continue to follow me on Twitter. I will probably continue to have content. Yeah, I don't really have anything to promote other than my ideas because, yeah.
Well, we help.
I'm out of this game. I'm taking a break from this. I'm going for 9 months. I'm going to study Arabic, and then I'm going to come back and hopefully get back into it.
Get back into the marketplace of ideas.
أنت تتكلم عربي؟ أنت
إيه درست العربية قليلا شوية بس فصحى طيب بس عاميتي مش طيب.
There you go. There you go. But I hope you will come back. I hope you enjoyed yourself, Matthew, and I hope you will come back. You know, even if you're busy, it will be great to have you on to talk about some Middle Eastern affairs. You've been a wonderful guest, and yeah, we definitely would love to have you back on in the future.
Just a couple of announcements before we head out. Our host, the birthday man from Thursday, Jason Miles, is going on vacation until our September 4th episode. So I will be holding down the fort with Gene Bajlan having my back and a couple of guest hosts as well. Tuesday, we will be having Conan Neutron with Doug Lane, and we'll be talking about the crisis of legitimacy and what that means for America and the world in terms of the crisis of legitimacy which we face today. Thursday, we will have guest host Kenzo Shibata, and our guest will be Vivek Sheber, and we'll be talking about postmodernism and its overall effect on the left. And Saturday, we will have myself with Gene and perhaps another co-host with Heidi Matthews, and we'll be talking about the crisis of masculinity and the rise of the reactionary right. So that will be our agenda for the week.
First week I'm gone. I'll still be doing the audio only podcast. It's still going up. Actually, right when I log off this, I'm going to have to set up my other computer and do the audio only podcast. And if you guys are interested, I have a new record out on my birthday. I released 2 records. One is music from my band. It's all under my band's name, Bitter Lake. You find it on there's links in the description to the show of the music, and all the music for the clips that we play. I released a record of just that called Revolutionary Instrumentals. So
happy birthday.
Thank you very much. 44. Gonna go see all 25 of my kids tomorrow. Some of them look like me. So
he doesn't have 25 kids.
No.
Well, not that he knows of.
Wow, talk about Gene playing some stereotypes out there, bro. Wow.
He brought it up.
It happened, right? I actually got a phone call. So
yeah, you know what they say about musicians.
Yep.
We make great dads.
Those people.
They don't call him they don't call him the spackler for nothing.
The spackler. That's really a gender insensitive phraseology there, Gene.
I thought it was because he did like drywall repairs.
Yeah, he's a drywall repair guy, guys.
I mean, they don't stay dry from Jason's
spackles.
we host down.
Yeah, Matthew's like, please, like, let's get out of here, please.
I just want to say this was one of the most fun shows I've done in a long time. And,
Matthew, thank you for coming on, and we hope you come on again.
Thank
It
you.
was very informative, and I think we did a very good conversation today.
And safe travels.
yes.
Thank you. I'm happy to come on. Just Jean, yeah, thanks to Jean for really inviting me. We've been going back and forth on Twitter for a while, but he hits me up like 2 months ago, and then I was really busy, so I took a really long time to get back to him. But I'm glad this finally happened.
Hey, great to have you.
You can't spell mouse without moist.
Kenzo Shibata, I'm excited for you to come in and host the show on Thursday. I can't wait to see Kenzo fuck with Pascal because he does it in a very different way than me, but it's equally as entertaining. Once you hear the music, you know it's time to go. Thank you guys very, very much. And, this is my last time saying this for a couple weeks. Enjoy some old school cartoons.